moral law. You cannot escape this. This is inescapable. To say that their influence was any other is to be completely blind to the facts of history. You could make an argument, you could make a case, and the case has been made. Aha! This is true, Brooks. But they did not abolish slavery. Doesn't that contradict God's moral law? In their minds, when they drafted the Constitution, it was, quote unquote, on the list of things to do. But they didn't get around to doing it. Now, I'm going to open up a can of worms right now. And I know that I'm going to have all these patriots come up to me and they're going to want to kick my rear end, take me out back, and take me to the woodshed regarding this. I'm just posing this as a question. It's just a question. What if the Founding Fathers held to a literal interpretation of Romans 13, 1 through 7? I see where you're going with that, and I don't like you or the implications. You communist pig. Well, let's see. The Revolution of 1776 probably would not have happened. And if the Revolution of 1776 would not have happened, and they would have continued to submit themselves to a jerk on the other side of the Atlantic, but yet were subject to its laws, which were, in fact, the basis of those laws were God's moral high laws, then within 20 years, William Wilberforce, who was influential and a stalwart and a bulldog for moral absolutes and the abolition of slavery, and eventually won the day in the British Parliament, not one shot would have been fired over the abolition of slavery on this continent. Not one. Just saying. Now, if I would have been there, I probably would have signed that declaration as big, and then I would have got my musket and run out there like Mel Gibson and the Patriot and everything else. But the point is this. Yes, they didn't get it all right all the time. But what they acknowledged was, in order to get it right, you have to go to a higher authority than the will of the people. That was their point. That was their point. I think Adams put it best when he said this: "We have no government armed with a power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." I'm going to update John Adams' quote, which was made in 1798. "The whale it swam through the net decades ago." That is a historical reality in our nation. That whale swam through that net decades ago, before I was born. So we are no longer living in our Founding Fathers' America. We're living in our America, who does not govern itself by the rule of law, which is based upon a higher absolute authority. Now, there are many in our nation who say and clamor that we should go back to the Founding Fathers. I would be among them. I think that what they had going was a good idea. I really do. But that's not common anymore. It's not even common for our children to learn everything that you've learned. How many of you, that's the first time you've ever heard any of this? Just show of hands. That's those of you who are willing to admit that this is the first time. I can promise you I learned none of this in high school and none of this in college. Absolutely none of it. Everything I've learned about what the Founding Fathers actually said was postgraduate. Not postgraduate in terms of a formal study, my master's or my doctorate, but after I graduated college, just looking into what the Founding Fathers actually said. I just glibly assumed, that separation of church and state was actually penned and actually written into the Constitution, which, of course, it is not. Now, here's the question. Who cares what the Founding Fathers said? Honestly, Romans 13 was written not to people that lived in a republic. They lived in a totalitarian dictatorship ruled by Nero. So the issue here isn't really how do we govern ourselves in this nation, although that's applicable. That's certainly an application of Romans 1 through 13, 1 through 10. The question really is, what does this have to do with us here and now, and how do we apply these principles? See, Adams and Paul both understood something very clearly. I want to point this out. Right here. Our government has no power to contend with human passion. Here's what Adams is saying. Civil law cannot truly control human passion. You can restrain evil by the tip of the sword. That's Romans 13, 1 through 7. You can do that. But what's the motive for not actually carrying out their passions in civil government? What's the motive? Fear of the sword, fear of punishment, correct? Now, human beings are clever. They will look for loopholes around the sword. Or, if they're in a democracy, they'll simply change the law so there is no punishment. That's what we are living in. That's our time and culture. That's why Adam said the civil law is not, it's not sufficient. It can't restrain evil. Unless those people are self-restrained. That's why he says our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. Only for a people who were ruled by the law of love. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love doesn't ever do anything wrong to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Adams and Paul both understood this, living in totally separate cultures. One in a representative republic, the other in a totalitarian, can't even say that word, dictatorship, governed by someone who demanded that people worship him as God. Totally different context, but the same principle is true. If you fulfill the law of love, you take care of the moral law. It's not an issue. And in doing so, you don't ever do any harm to your neighbor, so the civil law is a moot point. It's almost redundant. It's kind of a formality. You don't need policemen. In a culture in which everybody lived like that. Now, not everybody does, hence the necessity for policemen. You see, civil law can only restrain sin by force, but it can't contend with passion. God's moral law defines righteousness, but it can't contend with passion either. This is what Paul said in Romans chapter 3, verse 21. He says, the law doesn't make anyone righteous. It only reveals sin. That's all it does. The law shows us what we're supposed to be. And it says, this is my moral statutes, my decrees, and my laws. Teach them to your children. Walk in them. Live in them. But it gives us no power to do so or desire. We have no power